Akhenaten was a pharaoh in the 18th dynasty. Father of the famous King Tut, he would soon be known as the heretic king, given the extent to which the ancient Egyptians attempted to erase his legacy from history. Because of this effort, very little is known about Akhenaten. What we do know about him makes us wonder who, or what, Akhenaten really was. Beginning with appearance, his characteristics are unlike any pharaoh before him, choosing to depict his image quite literally. With almond-shaped eyes, a gorging potbelly, spindly limbs, and an elongated skull, his image was in stark contrast to every pharaoh that came before his reign, only depicting themselves at their peak physical form. Akhenaten soon shook the core paradigm of Egypt by creating the largest act of heresy the Egyptians had ever known. Akhenaten fervently proclaimed that the Egyptians would no longer believe in the pantheon of multiple gods, but would now only worship one god. As a result of this proclamation, it has been suspected that Akhenaten and the biblical Abraham might be just one and the same. Even with his bold decisions, Akhenaten did not truly believe in monotheism or the belief in one god. He absolutely believed other gods existed, but decided they would no longer be worshipped amongst the Egyptian populace. All worship and prayers would now be directed to a single entity known as Aten, also known as the sun. As a pharaoh, Akhenaten was an anomaly, from his aforementioned physical appearance to the much later study of his DNA. Stuart Fleischmann, assistant professor of comparative genomics at the Swiss University in Cairo, led a team that recently published the results of a 7-year study mapping the genomes of 9 ancient pharaohs. 8 of these pharaohs' genetic samples were completely normal, while the 9th sample extracted from the tomb of KV55, believed to be Akhenaten, was highly controversial. Fleischmann and his team subjected the precious ancient samples of DNA to a process known as polymerase chain reaction in the field of molecular biology. This technique is often used to replicate and amplify a single copy strand of DNA, giving researchers a clearer understanding of a genetic fingerprint. A small fragment of brain tissue had been the source of these DNA samples, while another test was conducted using bone tissue. Both yielded the same results conclusively. One of the identified genomes was CXPAC-5, largely responsible for cortex growth. It appears this increased activity in Akhenaten's genome would suggest that he had a higher cranial capacity, possibly on a physical level, to house a larger cortex. But what mutation would have caused his brain to grow? Telomerase, a genetic enzyme, is expanded by 2 processes exclusively: extreme aging and extreme mutation. Genetic and archaeological data suggests Akhenaten lived to be about 45 years of age. This is not nearly enough time to absorb and integrate the chromosomal telomerase. The hypothesis provided was also verified by the fact that under scrutiny of electron microscopes, analysts revealed signs of nucleotic signatures, a familiar observation of DNA helix healing after exposure to strong mutagens. As a result, the osseous tissue sample from the skull of Akhenaten was far thicker and fundamentally different from other mummies of the same age and period. Akhenaten's skull and skeletal structure were twice as dense and twice as strong as our modern human beings. Today, Stuart Fleischmann may be celebrated for making this incredible discovery. However, Stuart shouldn't pop the cork just yet, because we made a discovery of our own. There exists a link from ancient history that, perhaps intentionally, the academic world continues to overlook. Herodotus, also known as the world's first historian, gives a brief description about visiting an ancient battlefield between Egyptian and Persian armies presented within a recent film. Where the battle was fought, we can observe something curious: the bones of the deceased laying scattered along the fields in 2 lots, those of the Persians in one place by themselves, and the Egyptian remains in another. If one were to strike the Persian skulls, even with a pebble, they were so weak they would fracture and succumb to puncture, while the Egyptian skulls were so strong they barely garnered a scratch if one were to cast a stone upon them. The original theory to explain such an anomaly as presented by Herodotus is described in multiple literary expressions. The Egyptians from early childhood shaved their heads. Upon such prolonged exposure to the sun, the skulls became thick and hard. The same element has been reported to prevent balding in Egypt, where you see fewer bald men than in any other land. Such then is the reason why skulls of Egyptians are so strong, according to this intellectual construct. The Persians, on the other hand, had feeble skulls. They kept themselves shaded from the sun, donning turbans within their daily garb. Herodotus clearly hadn't the comprehension to accurately express the anomalous bone density, standing steadfast in the idea that the sun's influence kept Egyptians from losing hair and cultivating their thicker skulls. Going forward a couple thousand years, we now have a deeper understanding of the science of genetics. There are a few paragraphs written thousands of years ago that validates this modern genetic study. Adding to this discovery, and the scathing proof that Akhenaten was genetically different, is the observation that entire armies were genetically different as well. It's also interesting to note, having bones twice as strong as your opponents means absolutely possessing the advantage in battle. Like other countries at the time of the Persians, armies decimated the Egyptians. This led the way for Herodotus to make such an amazing discovery. The study may not prove alien hybrids were walking around with ancient Egyptians or ruling as pharaohs, but it certainly does suggest it. Currently, there is a second team attempting to reproduce Stuart Fleischmann's findings, optimistic to either disprove or validate his work. Was Akhenaten a hybrid alien with its own DNA? When it comes to ancient Egypt, no structure is more highly debated than the age of the Sphinx. Some people have ascertained it's over 5,000 years old, and yet others hold the conviction it may be between 12 and 13,000 years old. Even further, some have evidence suggesting the Sphinx may be up to 25,000 years old. Why such a vast difference in estimations? Why is there no consensus on the age of the Sphinx? There are a few things we know for sure. The Sphinx is older than the pyramids, and this has been agreed upon for many years. Yet, how do we know this? Referencing standard Egyptian chronology, there are records indicating the existence of the Sphinx before the reign of Khufu, the purported creator of the Great Pyramids. In modern times, when we had discovered the Sphinx, it was submerged in sand up to the neck, leading to the belief that the Sphinx consisted of nothing more than a head. But as excavation began to take place around Egypt, it was discovered that it was not just an artistic bust, but an entire body buried beneath the sand. Today, modern geologists who study the Sphinx have determined that the outside perimeter of the wall has been eroded away by rain and wind. It's fairly unanimous in the field of academia. There has been no inclement weather capable of creating this observation in the area for over 11,000 years. Even in ancient times, the Sphinx was deemed as ancient architecture, and the Sphinx is not an isolated inquiry. There's another location in Egypt that was considered to be ancient in our modern definition of ancient times. This temple is unlike any of the surrounding temples within the area. Initially beginning 15 meters underground, it's made from enormous, perfectly carved pieces of solid granite. Although granite is used in a lot of statues and blocks in Egypt, there are no buildings made entirely of this composite, except for the temple dedicated to Osirian. If that wasn't strange enough, the temple is lower than the natural water table, so every year it fills with water and has to be pumped out. Sometime later, a discovery was made that blew everything previously proposed out of the water. While the majority was wrapped up in the discovery of Tomb Osiris, people were distracted from the incredible engineering taking place during the period. The originators of this temple began with a shaft cut 20 feet straight down and banked a 90-degree angle that went outwards in distance of 40 feet or more and continued to follow straight down another 40 feet until a staging room containing 7 hollowed-out pits, wherein 7 granite stone sarcophagi lay dormant, was revealed. Discovered in one corner of this room was another shaft cut straight down 90 feet below the Sphinx. There, shrouded in darkness for thousands of years, they found the tomb of Osiris. The sarcophagus, measuring over 12 feet long, whose lid alone weighed 9 tons, was a sight to behold. It rested in a pool of water surrounded by 4 pillars on each corner. It appeared to be, at one time, black granite stone, obelisk, but any evidence otherwise has since been destroyed. Was there a god in this excavated tomb? Who was inside this giant sarcophagus? Egyptologists tell us that no body was ever discovered and that the tomb may be something more symbolic than literal. There is strong evidence suggesting this place was a space of prayer and worship. Although there are no remnants of offerings to the gods or sacrificial remains, the consensus within academia is that these artifacts did indeed occupy space within the tomb at one time. In way of accessing the tomb, there are no ladders or means of traditionally entering the space. Another interesting point is to address the shape and design of the tomb of Osiris overall. No markings are present throughout. No magical inscriptions to ensure the god king's passage, no gifts in way of crossing. It was blank, devoid of scripture, without a single hieroglyph on the tomb anywhere. It is considerably rare for a sarcophagus to be composed of solid granite, and there are no other locations possessing giant sarcophagi. The enigma of inquiry is just as mysterious as the tomb of Osiris. Again, weighing up to 50 tons, carved from a single block of granite, these sarcophagi were engineering feats. Sarcophagi in general were moved underground through hallways carved out of bedrock, barely wide enough for the transport to fit through. There is no shortage of theories on how they transported stones for constructing pyramids. Are there any other gods that have a tomb, symbolic or otherwise? Why is Osiris depicted with dark green alien skin? Was it to represent his death or what happens to the human body after it dies, a visceral depiction? Perhaps this decision on behalf of the artist was meant to represent an alien god who descended from the stars, or it was entirely a figment of his imagination. It does seem curious that the ancient Egyptians don't speak much of Osiris, wherein many men spoke about him as a king of their past. The premier king, creator of civilization, had his own land, as did his brother and sister as well. Osiris had his own people who prayed to him, temples dedicated to his name. Laws and rules were governed by his whim. To briefly illustrate, to showcase how far back in time Osiris supposedly existed, his primary governing supported creating a civilization that would not subscribe to cannibalism, banishing the practice in every form. This was the first law decreed by the Lord Osiris and has remained in the consciousness of humanity following. He made many proclamations, purchases, invasions on lands, traded slaves, ordered construction, and many other things one might expect from the common man, but he was no mere human. He was the first god king, Lord Osiris, creator of civilization.